Thank you. Thank you to Robert and Burnley College for asking me here today. I'm actually going to set things much more broadly, and I'm going to talk about psychology as a whole, because what I do on a week-to-week basis in term time is teach psychology to our 200 or so undergraduates every year. How many of you here are either doing an A-level in psychology or maybe teaching psychology in the school? Oh, fantastic. So we've got about 20 or 30 people whom this is particularly relevant. Okay, I'm going to take quite a radical angle on this, but it's kind of how I see things. I'm going to suggest that actually psychology has been taught and researched and to some degree practiced in not quite the right way for the last 100 years. And I'm going to go into detail as to why I think that's the case and provide you with a possible solution, certainly a theory that I'm interested in. Okay, so I'm going to characterize 5 blunders of psychology as these mistakes that have appeared over the last 100 years. I'm going to introduce an approach that hopefully avoids these blunders and explain to you how we teach this theory at the University of Manchester. But I don't want to disparage psychology as a whole. Learning psychology is extremely fun. It's about learning about people. It's about learning about emotions and feelings. It's one of those sciences that you choose because it's something where there's so many questions to still ask, and it's a very versatile qualification to have for careers. But if we look at what's published on psychology, I'm going to suggest to you there's 5 blunders that are sort of accepted to varying degrees by different people. I'm going to call them isolation, reification, the toothbrush problem, the linear model, and lies, damn lies, and statistics. Okay. The first one, isolation. Psychology as a discipline now is relatively isolated compared to when it emerged at the end of the 19th century. When it did so, it was part of philosophy, of physiology and psychiatry. They emerged together, and the people that wrote in one area, like William James, wrote in these other domains as well. They're very tightly linked. But in the late 19th century, psychology as a whole emerged as a discipline, and departments started to arise around the world where people did experimental psychology. And then in the 20th century, it became something that you can do now as a degree and obviously as an A-level. But what is a problem about doing psychology as a discipline in itself? There's some key problems here, I think. One is that we can never let go of the fact, I believe, that the mind, what we study in psychology, is what the brain does. So we're always going to have to appreciate that anything we're understanding about how we think is going to have some manifestations in the brain itself, in biology. The other thing is that we know that the nervous system, that the human nervous system particularly, evolved over millions and millions of years. How are we going to incorporate this huge element of training and learning into our understanding of how the mind works? We also find that we start doing our own little methods in psychology and maybe lose sight of the fact that we need to step back and critique sometimes the paradigms that we use. And psychology is one of those domains that has real impact to the wider humanities in terms of sort of cultural and political domains. And I think if we can appreciate this connectedness of psychology to the rest of science and humanities, we get a bit more realization about how we can practice psychology in the real world. And I'd argue that a lot of the psychology we study isn't like this. It's very isolated. The other problem with psychology is what's called reification. That's making a thing out of something that isn't really a thing. We've given a word to something that psychologists have proposed exists. Things like intelligence, personality, even behaviour and mood are words that describe things that actually psychologists spend decades fighting over what they really mean. And it's very tempting sometimes to believe that we understand what this word is, what it means at a more fundamental level, when really we're just using a word that reifies and stands for something. And I think this is a real problem when we try and think scientifically. So, for example, it can feed into circular thinking. Why do people do well in psychology tests? Because they're more intelligent. How is intelligence measured? By taking psychology tests. We can get lost if we don't deconstruct and look underneath things. And I think really, if we really want to understand the answer to this, we have to go down and look at the processes that go on and how do they work. The other thing that is a key issue, I think, that the world-renowned psychologist Walter Mischel coined is what he called the toothbrush problem. And this is really a commentary on academia, and it's not specific to psychology, but it clearly has a real resonance. He said that psychological researchers are a bit like people sharing the same bathroom. Everyone wants their own toothbrush. Nobody wants to share somebody else's toothbrush. It's highly competitive to get funding. Psychologists are encouraged to be different, so they're encouraged to develop their own new theory. And so you get this proliferation of different theories out there. And it means that the discipline then becomes fragmented. And then we look at this and we think, can this really be the way that we're going to understand things, by having thousands of different theories out there? Well, that's a real challenge, I think, to academic psychology. The fourth point I'm going to cover, and maybe one of the most fundamental ones, is our belief in what's called the linear model, cause and effect, and in psychology, stimulus and response. I think it's characterized by this cartoon here, with two amoeba talking to each other. Stimulus, response. Don't you ever think? It's pointing to the fact that there's something in between the stimulus and the response. But if you read psychology now, you'll find that stimulus-response assumptions are not questioned. The idea that there's something in our environment that triggers a behaviour, even if in cognitive psychology that happens through some kind of something that goes on in our minds. We think about something in a certain way, we reason in a certain way, or we apply a mental algorithm. It's still a linear model. Somehow, something in our environment affects us and then we react. That's how psychology has often seen the world. But I'd like you to question and think about that for a moment. Do a little exercise here. I want you to divide into pairs. One of you is A and one of you is B, okay? A, I want you just to move your finger around in whatever pattern you want, and B, I want you to try and keep up with A and try and track where A is going. So turn to the person next to you, work out who's A and who's B, and B has to track A. You see a lot of people try and make it hard for each other doing this. Okay, you can stop that now. It's just a brief exercise, okay? I'm going to ask one simple question. Does A cause B? No. But A is, if you're very good at this, A is highly correlated with B, because B is tracking A so carefully. But A doesn't cause B because you're two independent beings with your own goals and your own sense of purpose. We'll come back to this. So, is this how we do things in the real world? No, I don't think we do react to things. We choose to see things that scare us. We create art. We sometimes suppress our feelings. And actually, if you look, going back again over 100 years to the origins of modern psychology, we find that the key people then didn't believe in a simple stimulus-response process. So John Dewey proposed that what we have is a circuit, not an arc or a broken segment of a circle. This circuit is more truly determined organic than reflex. And this is the key bit, because the motor response determines the stimulus just as truly as a sensory stimulus determines the movement. There is something internally, the behaviour is actually changing the perception and the stimulation. It's not just a stimulation triggering a reaction. Now what I'm going to show you is a little demo of this. Again, we have this assumption in psychology that behaviour is an outcome, and therefore we should be able to judge what a behaviour is and what causes behaviour. So I'm going to ask you to watch a short video, and I'm going to ask you whether you can tell what someone is doing by watching what they're doing, when I show you the video in a bit more detail, how does the mouse work on here? Sorry. Oh, it's down here. Right, sorry. You can edit that bit on the TED Talk. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a moment. The person on the right is moving this pen in the way they want to. The person on the left has been given an instruction, okay? And how they're moving, you can see the trace of how they're moving on the left. So I want you to try and work out what the instruction is that the person on the left has been given, okay? Okay, now I'd like you to talk to the person next to you and say what you think the instruction is that the person on the left was given. Actually. Okay. Right, anyone want to tell me what they thought the instruction was? Shout it out. Huh? Mirroring it. Put your hand up if you thought that the person on the left was either mirroring or copying what the person on the right was doing. Put your hand up if you think that. Okay, everyone who thinks that, put your hand up, including anyone here? Okay, you're all wrong. Okay. Any other suggestions of what the person on the left was instructed to do? Yeah. Doing the opposite. Anyone thought it was to do the opposite of the person left? Hand up. We're all wrong as well. Okay, next. Yep. Do what you want. Who thought it was to do what you want? A couple of other people, you're all wrong. Next. But no, it's good. Yep. How many other people thought that? People will claim this now, won't they? Some of our reaction. Yes, that is what they were doing. The person on the left, well done, that's brilliant, was trying to keep the knot of that rubber band immediately in line with the dots on the page. And so the reason why they're pulling the rubber band in the opposite way is not because they want to do the opposite at all. They just want to control what's important to them, which is to keep the knot over the dot. Okay? So what I'm going to suggest to you is that you can't, behaviours aren't triggered. You can't often tell what a behaviour, what even causes a behaviour. And really, a lot of the time, our behaviours are the way that we enact our purposes, the way that we control what matters to us in the world. So what this, I think, suggests to us is people control their own experiences. And I guess what I'm going to suggest to you is that we all have knots over dots. We all have things that we have a reference for of how we'd like them to be, and we go through life trying to bring our experiences in line to how we want them to be. We have internal goals, and the analogy here is getting the right temperature right for Goldilocks and her porridge. She wanted to get it just right, the right kind of temperature. And this is a process of control. And I'm going to come back to this in a second. But I'm just going to cover one of the other potential the blunders, which sort of link to this idea of a linear model, which is our statistics. We have independent variables and dependent variables, as though we could remove something from life and say this is completely independent from everything else, and we'll measure its effect on something else. But what happens when there are no independent variables? For example, negative thinking leads to low mood, but low mood leads to negative thinking. In this case, what we find is people try and look for weak effects, because in the real world there aren't these simple associations between things. But if we really want a strong theory, we should actually try and build models that are actually very similar to the things in the real world, so we don't have to try and ease out these effects using statistics. And that's what we do in the physical sciences. For example, if we build a prototype, we actually test whether it has the same properties as the real thing. So, what should we be doing in psychology? We should have a psychology that's not isolated, but grounded in science as a whole. but doesn't reify things, but tries to understand the mechanisms underneath them. There isn't a separate theory like these toothbrushes, but is a unified approach. There is not a linear standard model, but is dynamic and has a sense of purpose and intention, and that doesn't rely on statistics because it creates accurate models of real systems. I'm going to introduce to you a theory, which is what I teach and research at the University of Manchester. We have a group of international collaborators, which personally I think it addresses these points. This theory sets as its premise that all living things control their inputs, their sensory input and their perception, not their action. They actually use their action to control their experiences, or as Bill Powers, who developed the theory, describes, behaviour is the control of perception. He uses in this theory engineering principles to explain control in people and other animals. It's a very detailed theory, there's a key text on it, but in our third year module in Manchester we give an intensive course on all both the mathematics of it, the philosophy of it, but also how it's applied in therapy as well. And if you're interested in it, there's a website which we link into all these facets of the theory. These are kind of quotes that our students have come up with for us, not prompted at all, I promise. PCT as a theory inspires me more and makes greater sense than any other psychological theory I've studied in 3 years. Content has fueled many debates, even outside of lectures within my peer group, far more than any previous lectures. It may be the most practical and applicable module I've studied, in that it seems totally relevant to being outside the classroom unlike other aspects of psychology. And there are more quotes and there's more on the website, etc. Now, the theory is challenging because it challenges some of these assumptions I've described, and it's also based on something that psychologists maybe aren't used to thinking about, which is sort of working models and engineering. And this is the basic building block of control. This is proposed that a set of processes like this is going on thousands of times in parallel in the brain for us to control things that we experience, to engage in any kind of skillful action. Now, I haven't got time to go through this with you today, but essentially what's going on is we're getting some input, we're comparing it to our goal for that input, we're calculating the difference, and the bigger that difference, the greater our action, and we use that action to change something in the environment which feeds back to our perception so that we can always be sure that we've got things right where we want them to be. If we're aiming a gun, if we're tracking someone across the room, if we're even walking or speaking. And we do this despite disturbances, things in the environment which might take us off our path. It's a really lovely theory because it's been used for all kinds of really interesting things. There's a neat paper that's used it to model catching fly balls in baseball, where a model was built that actually replicates the exact same movements you get in fielders, and it also replicates the same image you get in the retina of a baseballer as they're moving round the pitch. And we know this because another study mounted a video camera on the shoulders of the fielder, so you can compare the computer's eye view of the ball with the fielder's eye view of the ball. But it's not restricted to this sort of coordination. There's some really interesting work in sociology, in human factors, robotics, economics, and in my particular area in psychological therapies, where we use questioning techniques about control to help people regain control of their lives. And rather than assuming that we know what people are doing through their behaviour, we're just using that to prompt a question to ask people, what are you trying to do here? What experience are you wanting right now? So we help them to tell us from the inside what their goals and intentions and purposes are. So, just to take a summary of my approach today, I've suggested that there have been some real big blunders in how psychology has been researched and taught over the last century, and therefore we need one that doesn't try to sidestep or challenge these blunders. And I'm putting it to you that this theory, it's actually been around for over 50 years, is one that really does challenge these. It's enjoyable and fun to learn itself, and even though it bridges the areas of social and physical science and life sciences, I think that's a challenge and a really interesting challenge. And so if you're a bit interested in it, plug that website in your mobile now and you can read a little bit more about it. So thanks for your time, and thanks again to Burnley College.
One question, presumably from a psychologist or a psychology student at least. Yes, Brendan.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Most of the time, other psychologists, some of which are colleagues of mine, ignore it rather than criticise it. So they just don't cite it and they just carry on doing the work they've been doing all this time. So that's been by far the most effective way of this theory not gaining purchase in the discipline, has just been to not to ignore it. There are some papers that have critiqued it. So you may have heard of Alfred Bandura, who developed the self-efficacy approach. He's written a sort of critical paper on it. But there's very few that tackle it directly. The best approach, it seems, by the discipline is just to pretend it's not there, when it is. Right, yeah.